Escape to DOS.
Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to complete the PcChips saga. If you haven't watched part 1 and part 2, please do, because they kind of explain why today is so special. Starting with the new board that I bought, I got a helpful comment from OzFan1000 who suggested that my DX4100 really only needs a heatsink so I could remove that noisy cooling fan. I can't stand the sound of whining hard drives, and I don't like noisy power supplies, so anything to reduce the volume is a plus. Next on the list is the CMOS battery holder. I took that from the Fugu Tech board. I really like this style because it's simple and it's right there on the board, but unfortunately I don't have any more of those. And this particular one came off some recycled electronics that I have. I did buy a package of those external ones, but I'm going to use that for the Fugu Tech board when I get to that. And off it comes. Easy enough. Next, I remove the remnants of the wires that were attached to the new board. And I sure do use a lot of that solder wick. Man, that stuff is valuable. I couldn't live without it, really. I flip over the board, and that is the blank spot where I'm going to insert that holder. And using just a little bit of the Chip Quick Flux, because that stuff really does make the solder flow much nicer. And a little scrub with the isopropyl. So there it is, transplanted. But we're not done yet. I have some blank BIOS chips, and we're going to do an update. So back on the retro web, there are two options for this. And I can't seem to find a description as to what the difference really is. Somewhere I saw something mentioned about small block for the S, but I've yet to find that again. Thus, I decided to make a copy of both of them and give it a test. One is labeled with an S at the end of the file name and the other with an L. Now, I bought these off of eBay, and fortunately they were blank when I received them, so all I had to do was begin the programming process. Now, after watching Adrian Black do this, he runs them through several times, just to be sure that all the information gets onto the BIOS chip. So I just assumed that you couldn't do that because you'd have to clear them first before you'd be able to reprogram them, but whatever. That's my new approach, so I run them through at least 2 times just to be sure. And it only takes a minute or 2, so even if it doesn't make a difference, it's not a big deal. I'm using copper tape to block the sunlight on the window, and here we go. We have my L version and the S version and the old BIOS chip. And this is where the frustration started to happen. I'm using a 1 gigabyte compact flash card, and that's connected to my VLB controller card. And this is using the L version of the updated BIOS. But when I tried to install DOS, it would fail. Didn't matter if I selected the LBA option or if I just used the normal option, it would fail. I've had all kinds of strange issues with CF cards and SD cards in retro machines, and sometimes you just gotta try another card because that one will not work with the machine. And as a result, I wasted all kinds of time trying different SD cards and different CF cards to no avail because that wasn't the problem. And then I decided to look at the BIOS. So let's take a step back and look at the original BIOS. There are only the 4 categories in setup: standard, advanced, chipset, and power management. And at the bottom of the chipset setup, you will find PCI onboard IDE drive right there, which was fine because I was using a VLB controller card. Now, I did find it confusing when I first looked at this 5 years ago, the fact that it was labeled PCI and not just onboard IDE. But they decided to make a change when they moved on to the L version of the BIOS. They added a completely new category called peripheral, and on the top of that you find PCI onboard IDE. And of course, I didn't bother to check that that was enabled by default. So to further complicate matters, if you look at the S version of the BIOS ROM, and that is made obvious by the S that is on the boot screen. And now when you go to the peripheral category, right at the top, onboard FDC. Now on the M915i board, there is no floppy disk controller, there is no serial port, there's no parallel port, they're all set to disabled anyway. And of course, the PCI onboard ID is set to disabled, just like the original BIOS. When I was testing the L version of the BIOS, of course, it had the PCI onboard enabled, so that's what was causing my conflict with my controller card. So this is the L version of the BIOS, and I'm going to demonstrate what happens when the onboard IDE is set to enabled. Sometimes it works. Sometimes you get past this, you get right into the operating system. Takes me to my menu screen, and I'm going to select DOS Bench number 4 and attempt to get into system information, K. And there you go, it hangs. And this is what happens. So I decide to reboot and try it again. No good. Okay, sped things up a little bit, and here we are. I get into Phil's option number 1, and stuck. There it is. And it's not because I don't have a CD-ROM connected. So let's try it one more time. And these are one after another. We get this far. And there you go. You get no further than that. Back into the BIOS. My IDE is selected. And into peripheral, and let's disable the onboard IDE and try it again. I'm speeding this up, ripping into that, selecting Doom 2 because it's always good for testing. So far so good. Everything seems to be functioning like it's supposed to. And I don't have the sound on currently. I don't have the sound card plugged in. I will demonstrate that shortly. And of course, you gotta get that chainsaw. And that wraps up the issue with the BIOS that I was having. Next on the list, I discovered there is another problem. Alright, so right now the computer is on, sort of. And I'm going to touch the connector, and then it'll jump into life. Ta-da! That wasn't a problem when I first started connecting the board together, but, you know, you move things around enough and then 30-year-old solder joints eventually break. Off camera, I resoldered the power connections and that fixed the problem. So next on the list is the VLB video issue. This is a quirky one because it's only a problem with digitized sound and a VLB card. The first one I'll demonstrate the problem with is my original Diamond Speedstar Pro card. I first realized this when I was assembling my own wood grain 486, and anyone who's watched LGR for any length of time has seen him play Duke Nukem 3D at some point. So of course I had to try that myself. So I used my Pentium 1 with the MMX 233 chip, and it smokes on that, so I thought, well, let's see how well it works on a 486 with a VLB card. And this is what I discovered. Without sound, or even with just music, it works perfectly. But as soon as you select digitized sound in the Duke 3D setup, it corrupts the video. And it looks like this. And it doesn't matter what IRQ you set. I tried all the DMA channels. I even tried both VLB slots, and I bought a brand new board and it does the same damn thing, which was kind of disappointing because if you remember back from part 2, the gentleman that sold me all the parts had gone on at great length about how incredible the VLB cards were, and this was a big deal about this motherboard. But no matter what I tried to do, I cannot get this VLB card to work correctly with digitized sound. Well, of course you're saying, well, try a different card, right? Well, VLB cards are expensive and they're kind of hard to find. But I found one. After a long search, and it was the cheapest one I could find, and I managed to get one without a bracket, which lowered the price. I made that one myself, and it was a bit of a trick finding drivers, but I think I got them at Vogons. Well, try it again. Installed the card, loaded up Duke Nukem 3D, and what do we get? Made sure I had digitized sound, fingers crossed. Same results. Different card, different board, same results. Nothing has changed. So you're saying to yourself, well, maybe it's just those two cards. What if you had a third card? What if there was another VLB video card to test? If only. Well, back in Series 1, there was this machine. It was the Fortiva 5000. And this machine, I'm going to be discussing this thing in the future, has a VLB card in it. And that was very exciting to find out. It's got a Trident VLB card. So a completely different manufacturer, completely different card. It's got to give me different results, doesn't it? Like, you know, you'd hope the third attempt at this is going to be the charm. But no, no, it's exactly the same. So at this point, I knew that there was going to be a problem. I wasn't anticipating that it was magically going to work. So this wasn't as disappointing as when I bought the Paradise card. But it's still disappointing. And still to this day, I have no idea why a VLB card won't work. Now, let me demonstrate what will work on this computer. So for the sound, I'm using an Aztec ISA card. It's got a 5 on there because I have an upcoming video where I'll be demonstrating the sound differences between the Sound Blaster card and 10 others. Okay, test with the PCI S3 video card. Only with the PCI video card will this computer function correctly with digitized audio. And that's what you want to see. Correct color, correct speed. It's a 486, it only goes so fast, takes a bit to load up. But everything works exactly like it's supposed to. Now, of course, I tried this when I first had the Fugu Tech board running. PCI on a PcChips.
Piece of cake.
But VLB is not a piece of cake. I have yet to figure this out. I figured out all of the issues on this board except for one. And for that, I'm going to give it 4 out of 5. As far as my success goes on this. And now, until maybe somebody out there can explain to me how to make that work, I'm stuck where I'm at. But PcChips, you know, this was one of your better boards. Next, we need to discuss my old Fugu Tech board. This is the one that I started with. And back in part 2, I explained my successes and failures with this board. And eventually spent most of its time hanging on the wall just to remind me of what mistakes I should never make again. And while I was experimenting with the new PcChips board, I thought, well, let's just have another look. So this video here is back in February of 22. I was attempting to get this thing to work correctly, and this was one of the problems where it just would not start. And then out of the blue, suddenly it would fire up. And it was so intermittent and so annoying, and eventually that's what led me to giving up on the thing. One thing I did notice when I was experimenting with the board before was that depending on where I touched on the board, well, sometimes it would post. And now I'm demonstrating how just firing the thing up normally, absolutely nothing, will not go past that first 3-0. So just pressing on the chip while it's running had no effect, but if I hold down the chip and then turn it back on, that spot seemed to be giving me the most consistent results. What I needed was a closer view. And because of all the experience that I've had so far of repairing traces on those 386 boards with my microscope, I decided to have a good look at this board. So until I bought that electronic microscope, I was just using a magnifying glass, and looking at those tiny little legs, I could not see for the life of me that they were loose. But using that tiny little screwdriver, those first 3 legs there are no longer soldered to the board. They are just hovering slightly above it. Time to do some micro soldering. Okay, so right to the chip quick solder paste. I'm not bothering with that AliExpress stuff anymore. I didn't get very good results with that. Thinking about it now, I almost think that it'd be better to use something to press the legs down as you're soldering these, just to keep them as close to the board as possible. Because, it's just a little bit difficult to get the solder to bridge from the pads underneath to the leg. But regardless, after enough fine-tuning on this, I got all the connections that I needed. So I did have to bring in the solder braid because I had bridged a couple of those legs. But after a little bit of a cleanup, there it was, all completed. I put it back into the test rig and hit the switch, and the very first time it fired up. And I hadn't seen that happen since I don't know when. But this is the intermittent issue with this board, so we're going to try it one more time. And sure enough, it posts. So I think I'm on the road to success. Of course, next I had to try installing DOS 6.22 because, as I've mentioned before, that to me is sort of definitive test as to whether or not it is functioning with the CF card or whatever storage you're using. So easily I burn through this and I get to 100% and all is looking good. One of the peculiar aspects of this particular board is the cache. Now it affects the performance of the machine, but when you go to test it in cache check, it says that there's only one cache and there is no L2. Now, when you boot up and you get the opening screen, it tells you, we're going to see there, 512K cache memory. And it clearly runs much faster, so the cache is working, but in cache check, it doesn't see it. And I'm speeding this up because it takes forever. There you are. Doesn't matter which version of the BIOS I use, it always comes up with this machine seems to have one cache. And I did add the CMOS battery connection, and I used hot glue to hold the wires down to avoid them getting shaken off, but that looks terrible. Well, after I put the cache in, and I put in a 66 megahertz DX2 chip, well, then I got this. It was not starting correctly. Refuses to post. Oops. Unless I turn off, turn on again, turn off, turn on again. One more time. And there we go. Turn it off. Turn it on again. Nope. Turn it off. So I noticed when I was searching around on the board, now that I have properly soldered all of the legs on those chips, when I was searching around the board, pushing on various spots, I accidentally touched these two leads. When I touched those two leads, which with the AM486 chip, those two are left open, what I noticed was suddenly it worked correctly. So I will simulate that by putting a jumper on those two leads, and I'll hit the switch again. And we get boot every single time, without fail. I'm still unable to get the 80 megahertz DX2 chip, which is a 3.3 volt chip. I'm still unable to get that to work. I don't know why. But currently, with my extra jumper, this board works 100%. And that makes me kind of happy. But it's still a work in progress. Maybe I'll be able to figure out why it doesn't work with the 3.3 volts. And maybe something is damaged on the board that is affecting that and is also affecting why this extra jumper is required. I don't know, but that's PcChips for you. At one point I thought my only solution to this problem was something along these lines. I kind of imagined snapping the board right in half so I'd never have to think about it ever again. But that's only so satisfying. What is more satisfying is knowing that I have made an incremental change in this board. So it is functioning now. It will post. It will run programs. It starts and stops just like it's supposed to. But as soon as I remove that jumper, it will take 5 or more attempts at it to get it to post. And that is frustrating. Next on the list, I'm unable to get it to work with anything other than a 5-volt CPU. And that's disappointing as well because I was really hoping to run the DX4100 on this board. I'm assuming that I must have damaged something when I put the original DX33 chip in the wrong way. I do get 3.3 volts from the socket, but maybe there's something else that's damaged, and I haven't found that yet. The third issue with this board is the fact that it just can't see the cache when I use cache check, and whether that matters or not, I don't really know, because whether it sees it or not, it's functioning as if it's there. Lastly, it's the VLB issue with this board, just like the PcChips branded board. Doesn't work. No, it isn't. After trying 3 different VLB cards and using 2 different motherboards, getting exactly the same results, I tried as many changes in the BIOS as possible, and not a single thing has ever made any difference. So I've resigned myself to using a PCI video card with either of these motherboards. Which leaves me with a VLB card and no motherboard. And that brings us to the end of the PcChips tale, at least for now. Both boards work, one better than the other, and that's why one is going to find a home in one of those beige cases that I had from Series 1. I still haven't filled those cases, and that's going to be all in Series 2. But now that the PcChips video is over, I've got all these loose ends to tie up from my previous videos. I made a list. Okay, so there's the sound card video I mentioned. I gotta test that Voodoo 3 that I got. There's the Fortifa 5000. There's... what is this? Back in the untested gamble video, I said we are done gambling. Whoa, come on, not another one. I've still got that Coast stick to check out. Oh no, look at this. I still gotta fix that removable hard drive. recap that MS6309 board. I got a whole pile of AGP video cards to test. Plus there's a Voodoo 2 I gotta try to fix. Oh, there I go gambling.